All right, this is lecture number 7 for World War II. Today the topic is going to be the Pacific Theater, and we're going to, continue. We've finished the war in Europe, and now we're going to talk about the war in the Pacific, okay, with Japan. All right, so the first thing we're talking about is the Battle of the Philippines. Battle of the Philippines, there are 80,000 Filipinos and Americans battling to maintain control of the Philippines. It's led by General MacArthur, but he's recalled by FDR in March of 1942 because the Philippine-American War, or the Philippine conflict is not going so well. And the Americans are forced to surrender, and FDR gets MacArthur out because he knows how important and how valuable he is. And basically, he vows to return back to the Philippines to finish his battle there. As I said, the Battle of the Philippines, we ended up surrendering. And it's a surprise to the United States forces, and the surrender is done by our General Wainwright. It's the largest number of U.S. forces surrendered in all of military history, and our U.S. POWs, which are prisoners of war, at the time actually outnumber the Japanese troops in the Philippines. Okay, and if you know what's in store for them, it's something called the Bataan Death March. All right, so they go from Bataan up to Camp O'Donnell. Okay, this is Manila Bay here. All right, it should sound a little bit familiar in the Philippine-American War, the Spanish-American War, sorry. So they end up having to march all the way up here, and we'll talk about what happens. Okay, so here's a quote. It says, "The treatment of the American prisoners was characterized by its dehumanization, as the Imperial soldiery felt they were dealing with subhuman animals. Trucks were known to drive over those who fell or succumbed to fatigue. Cleanup crews put to death those too weak to continue. Marchers were harassed with random bayonet stabs and beatings. Accounts of being forcibly marched for 5 to 6 days with no food and a single sip of water are in post-war archives, including film reports." It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Trail of Tears when we marched the Cherokees across the country. Same sort of idea. The Japanese felt they were superior to us, and if we weren't in line, they would just kill us. Here's a poster you've already seen. It says, "What are you doing? What are you going to do about it?" So it's talking about the Bataan Death March. You can see them marching these soldiers back here, and this guy hitting this guy in the face. You can see that the language is very harsh. So the murdering Jap, they're really trying to portray the Japanese as evil. You look at their face; they don't even look human. So it's really putting a bad light on the Japanese. All right, so here's some pictures of the Bataan Death March. Okay, the very famous picture of the soldier being executed. A dark part in our history. So we're going to move on from the Bataan Death March, and the Japanese are suffering from a strong case of victory disease. They're greedy and overconfident. With the expansion of the Japanese empire, Japan had suffered minimal losses to this point. The problem is they're taking over all this territory in the Pacific, and it's so spread out, and Japan's so small that they really can't defend it. There's too many islands. There's too much there. They can't really keep it. We talk about Hitler having a 2-front war. Imagine having, a 20, 30, 40-front war because they have to defend every island that they own. We have the Doolittle raids next. Okay, and the Doolittle raids come out of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We get attacked at Pearl Harbor, and we really want to, get them back. So what we want to do is bomb their mainland. So of April 18th of 1942, we go ahead and do that. We soup up a bunch of bombers, and we put them on an aircraft carrier, and we send them out, and we have them bomb Tokyo. It's really unique because these aircraft carriers were not meant to hold these bombers. They had to strip them down of all their parts to make them really light and able to fly there. It was basically a one-way mission. They were going to bomb Tokyo and then land in Japan. So it's the first raid by the U.S. to strike the mainland of Japan. It showed that Japanese were vulnerable. They felt that no one could touch them. Okay, and what it really does is it raises morale for the U.S. It doesn't do anything for the war effort. Really, we take out a couple of factories in Japan, but it is a morale boost to the United States. Okay. Here's a picture of the bombers coming off the aircraft carriers. Next battle is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Okay, and the Coral Sea, you kind of relate to the Great Barrier Reef, and that's going to be the battle for Australia. So it's Japan versus the Allied forces and the Australians, and they want to fight for control of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Japan was hoping to isolate Australia and leave it open for the Japanese takeover. They wanted to basically take Australia. So not a single shot is fired by surface ships. So it's the first time in history. It's fought entirely entirely by airplanes that are flown off aircraft carriers, and it shows the strength of the aircraft carriers and what they really needed to do, or what the future of warfare was like. In previous wars, big ships with huge guns wouldn't get near each other and shoot at each other. Now, it's airplanes that do all the damage. Really truly long-range weapons. It's the first time the Japanese invasion was fought and turned back. The tide's starting to turn. And a point to consider is that, we haven't really talked too much about Japan this year. Hopefully you learned something about it last year, but we'll talk about it later. That Japan can't recover in terms of industrially as quickly as the U.S. There's not as many people building materials that are building ships and stuff there. They're overexpanding. There's too much to protect. They don't have that many resources, and we'll talk about that later on. But if you don't have resources, you can't rebuild. And the United States has tons of resources, and they're able to rebuild pretty quickly. So any defeat for the Japanese is way more crippling than it would be for the United States. All right, the next battle is the Battle of Midway. You can see Midway Island is located midway between the United States and Asia. Okay, aptly named. So it's Japan versus the U.S. Allied forces, and basically it's an offensive attack by the Japanese. They hope to destroy U.S. forces in the Pacific and then negotiate a peace, but that didn't really work out. The Japanese Armada had spanned 2,000 miles of the Pacific, and they wanted to draw our fleet out of Pearl Harbor to totally destroy it. Okay, it's ironic though, because the opposite actually is achieved, and Japan is almost totally crippled after the battle's end. Okay, we broke their code, we knew about their attack, and they were sitting ducks. We basically hid and waited for them to come through, and we attacked them. And we basically picked them off one by one with our dive bombers, which are a new technology, which you'll see a video on that later. Alright, it's one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific. We destroyed half their aircraft carriers, and they're never able to fully recover. And they're just basically on the defense after that. So our allies are on the offensive in the Pacific, and we're starting to island hop. So, and MacArthur returns and goes to fight. Okay, so there's a ton of islands outside of Japan, and instead of going and taking every single island, we hop from the islands that are of strategic importance. So we're not going to waste our manpower and waste our, blood and our tears and blood and our treasure on these islands that don't have any significance. So we are going to kind of move around and go from one to another, as opposed to just really trying to take out everything, because we know, you want to take those out of are strategically important. All right, so the first one is Iwo Jima. This is a very, very famous picture. The Marines are putting their flag up on top of the volcano there, and it's there's a movie called Flags of Our Fathers that was created out of this image. There's a World War II memorial that's created out of this image as well. So it's an all-marine mission versus Japan. We basically want an airfield closer to Japan so we can start getting bombers there and start really striking the mainland with bombs. Okay, if we got to that point of actually taking over the mainland of Japan. All right, so Japanese strategy is they do not fight above ground. They dug tons of tunnels. There's 1,500 rooms into rock, and they're connected by 16 miles of tunnels. The strategy called for no Japanese survivors. Only 200 of the 22,000 Japanese men survived. So basically, their goal was to kill 10 U.S. soldiers before they were killed. They would peek up underneath from underground and wait for the U.S. soldiers to get onto land, and then they would attack. All right. So prior to the attack, U.S. forces pounded the island for a month straight, the longest sustained aerial offensive of the war. But the bombing helped the Japanese because they knew where the Americans would actually land their attack, because obviously you're going to bomb where you want to attack to try to devastate that land before you get there. So the U.S. soldiers are forced to fight above ground while the Japanese fight from below. The Marines rarely saw Japanese soldiers, while the Japanese soldiers could see them perfectly. We started using napalm, liquid gas, hand grenades, and tenacity basically to win the war, or win the battle. The next is Okinawa. We're moving closer and closer to Japan, and we're gaining the necessary bases to carry out Operation Downfall, and Operation Downfall is the attack of the mainland. So we had no intelligence of the island prior to the attack. We thought there'd be about 65,000 Japanese on the island. There were actually 130,000 soldiers and 450,000 civilians, and we only sent in 180,000. And the thing about Japanese civilians is they were brainwashed into thinking that we would come in and rape their women and kill them and do all these really negative things, when obviously we weren't going to do that. So they would arm men and women and children, and they were actually people that we had to worry about as well. So it wasn't like 450,000 people that weren't going to do anything. It was, people that might inject themselves in the war in some way. All right, so what ends up happening is, they have the same sort of tactics as far as battle. They're underground, but this is where we start to see kamikaze attacks. Okay, and kamikaze attacks are basically one-way flights where they would fly out and fly their planes into our boats. So typically there'd be 1 to 20 of these a day, but there are a couple of really high intensity days. On April 6th, there were 355, and on April 12th, 185. All right. So at the end of the battle, there's 7,600 Americans died, 110,000 Japanese died, and it kind of is a glimpse into what the invasion of Japan would really be like. All right, so we know that there'd be thousands upon thousands, and some people project millions of casualties because the Japanese were willing to kill themselves in order to either protect themselves or protect their land, or to save their honor. So there's actually like videos of people jumping off cliffs in order to avoid being captured by the United States soldiers, which is not really true and wouldn't really happen. So there's things that President Truman has to start to consider, and we obviously know what comes next, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. So that's going to be it. Thank you.